The Renaissance sun cast long shadows across the stone corridors of the Palazzo Vecchio as Lorenzo de' Medici walked purposefully toward his private study. The year was 1513, and Florence buzzed with whispers of political intrigue, betrayal, and the delicate dance of power that had defined Italian city-states for centuries. In a chamber not far from where Lorenzo conducted the affairs of state, a disgraced diplomat named Niccolò Machiavelli sat hunched over his desk, scratching out observations that would forever change how humanity understood the nature of power, defense, and the paradoxical strength found in apparent weakness. Machiavelli had learned something profound during his years of political exile and personal humiliation. He had watched powerful men fall not because they were attacked by superior forces, but because they had become so invested in defending their constructed identities that they forgot the fundamental truth of power. The strongest position is often the one that appears most vulnerable, and the most defended fortress is actually the most easily conquered. The concept that would emerge from his observations was revolutionary in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Never defend yourself, he would write, because in the act of defense, you reveal not only your weaknesses but your attachment to a self that can be destroyed. The man who destroys his weak self, the collection of fears, insecurities, social expectations, and ego-driven needs that most people mistake for their true identity, becomes invulnerable to the attacks of others because there is nothing left to defend. This was not merely a political strategy but a complete philosophy of existence that challenged every assumption about human nature, social interaction, and the pursuit of power. To understand its full implications, one must journey through the landscapes of human psychology, political maneuvering, and spiritual transformation that Machiavelli observed in the courts and battlefields of Renaissance Italy. In the bustling mercantile districts of Florence, a young banker named Alessandro Corsini exemplified everything that Machiavelli would later identify as the weak self that must be destroyed. Alessandro had built his identity around his reputation for honesty, his standing in the guild of bankers, his elegant palazzo, and his carefully cultivated relationships with influential families. He wore his success like armor, defending every slight against his reputation, responding to every criticism with elaborate justifications, and constantly working to maintain the image he had constructed of himself as an indispensable member of Florentine society. When rumors began circulating that Alessandro had made questionable loans to a rival family, his first instinct was defensive. He gathered testimonials from satisfied clients, organized elaborate dinners to display his continuing prosperity, and spent considerable energy refuting each specific allegation. The more he defended himself, the more attention the rumors received. His defensive behavior became evidence of guilt in the minds of many observers, and his reputation, the very thing he sought to protect, began to crumble under the weight of his own defensive efforts. Meanwhile, across the city, another banker named Giovanni Vespucci faced similar accusations. But Giovanni had internalized a different approach to such challenges. Rather than defending himself, he simply acknowledged the rumors with a slight smile and continued his business as usual. When pressed for a response, he would say, "Perhaps there is truth in what you have heard. I have made many mistakes in my career, and I will undoubtedly make many more. What matters is not whether I am perfect, but whether I can serve my clients well today." This response confounded his critics. How do you attack someone who refuses to defend themselves? How do you damage the reputation of someone who freely admits their imperfections? Giovanni's willingness to acknowledge his fallibility paradoxically enhanced his reputation for wisdom and authenticity. Clients who might have fled from Alessandro's desperate defensiveness found themselves drawn to Giovanni's calm acceptance of human limitation. The difference between these two men illustrated the core of Machiavelli's insight. Alessandro had attached his sense of self-worth to external validation and spent his energy defending a constructed identity that could be attacked and destroyed. Giovanni had recognized that this constructed identity, the weak self, was actually the source of his vulnerability. By destroying his attachment to reputation, to the need for others' approval, and to the illusion of perfection, he had made himself invulnerable to the very attacks that devastated his competitor. This principle extended far beyond individual psychology into the realm of political power. Machiavelli observed that the most secure rulers were not those who built the highest walls around their territories, but those who ruled with such apparent vulnerability that their enemies could find no effective point of attack. A prince who admits his mistakes cannot be accused of deception. A leader who acknowledges his limitations cannot be criticized for pretending to omniscience. A ruler who openly discusses his fears cannot be undermined by those who seek to expose his weaknesses. The great irony was that defensive behavior, while appearing to show strength, actually demonstrated weakness and created vulnerability. When a leader rushes to defend himself against criticism, he reveals that the criticism has power over him. When a politician carefully crafts responses to every allegation, he shows that his position depends on public opinion rather than genuine authority. When a ruler builds elaborate defenses around himself, he advertises his fear and invites attack from those who sense his desperation. But this philosophy demanded something that most people found nearly impossible to achieve: the complete destruction of the ego-driven self that craves validation, fears judgment, and seeks to control how others perceive it. This was not simply a matter of developing thicker skin or learning to ignore criticism. It required a fundamental transformation of consciousness that Machiavelli recognized as the difference between those who wielded genuine power and those who merely appeared powerful. The practical application of this principle could be observed in the court of Cesare Borgia, whom Machiavelli studied extensively and later immortalized in The Prince. Borgia had mastered the art of strategic vulnerability, allowing his enemies to believe they had found his weaknesses while simultaneously making himself immune to their attacks through his refusal to defend what others expected him to defend. When accusations of cruelty circulated throughout Italy, Borgia did not issue proclamations about his mercy or organize demonstrations of his compassion. Instead, he acknowledged his ruthlessness openly, explaining that cruelty in service of order was preferable to the chaos that resulted from misplaced mercy. His enemies, prepared to attack him for hypocrisy, found themselves without a target when he freely admitted to the very qualities they sought to use against him. When his legitimacy was questioned due to his father's position as pope, Borgia did not construct elaborate genealogies or legal justifications for his authority. He simply stated that power came from the ability to use it effectively, not from inherited bloodlines or institutional approval. By destroying his attachment to traditional sources of legitimacy, he made himself immune to attacks based on those traditional criteria. This approach required a level of self-knowledge and psychological sophistication that went far beyond conventional political maneuvering. It demanded that an individual identify all the aspects of their constructed identity that could be used against them: their reputation, their relationships, their possessions, their beliefs about themselves, and systematically destroy their attachment to these external sources of validation. The process was not unlike what later spiritual traditions would call ego death, or what psychologists would recognize as the dissolution of the false self. But Machiavelli approached it from a purely practical perspective, recognizing that attachment to any aspect of the constructed self created vulnerability that enemies could exploit. In the commercial sphere, he observed merchants who had learned to detach themselves from their business reputation in ways that paradoxically enhanced their success. These traders did not defend themselves against accusations of greed or sharp dealing. Instead, they openly acknowledged their pursuit of profit while demonstrating that this pursuit served the broader interests of economic development and social prosperity. By refusing to defend themselves against charges that were fundamentally accurate, they transformed potential weaknesses into demonstrations of honesty and self-awareness. The psychological transformation required for this approach involved recognizing the difference between the essential self, the consciousness that observes thoughts, emotions, and experiences, and the constructed self composed of social roles, personal history, and ego-driven desires. The constructed self, being dependent on external validation and maintenance, was inherently vulnerable to attack. The essential self, having no investment in any particular outcome or identity, could not be meaningfully threatened. This distinction had profound implications for how one approached conflict and criticism. When operating from the constructed self, any attack on one's reputation, beliefs, or behavior felt like a threat to one's very existence, triggering defensive responses that often made the situation worse. When operating from the essential self, criticism became simply information about how others perceived certain behaviors or decisions, carrying no threat to one's fundamental well-being. Machiavelli recognized that most people spent their entire lives defending and maintaining their constructed selves, never realizing that this very effort was the source of their vulnerability and suffering. The man who could destroy his attachment to this false identity not through self-hatred or nihilism, but through clear-seeing recognition of its illusory nature, became invulnerable to the manipulations and attacks of others because there was nothing left that could be meaningfully threatened. The transformation from defensive positioning to strategic invulnerability required a complete reimagining of what constituted strength and weakness in human interaction. Traditional wisdom suggested that showing vulnerability invited attack, but Machiavelli's observations revealed the opposite. Strategic vulnerability disarmed attackers while defensive behavior provided them with targets and energy. In the diplomatic relations between Italian city-states, he watched as the most secure alliances were formed not between parties who presented themselves as invulnerable, but between those who could honestly acknowledge their limitations while demonstrating their core competencies. A state that admitted its military weaknesses while showcasing its commercial strengths could forge partnerships with militarily powerful but economically struggling neighbors. The honesty about limitations created trust, while the demonstration of genuine strengths provided value to potential allies. Contrast this with states that spent enormous resources creating illusions of comprehensive strength. These artificially enhanced powers constantly lived in fear that their deceptions would be discovered, requiring ever-increasing investments in maintaining false impressions. Their defensive behavior, the careful management of information, the elaborate displays of power they did not possess, the aggressive responses to any questioning of their capabilities actually advertised their insecurity to astute observers. The principle extended into personal relationships as well. Machiavelli noted that individuals who tried to present perfect facades in their social interactions often found themselves isolated and mistrusted. Their perfectionist presentations felt inauthentic to others, while their defensive responses to any criticism created emotional distance. Meanwhile, those who could acknowledge their flaws and mistakes while maintaining confidence in their core competencies tended to develop deeper and more enduring relationships. This paradox occurred because human beings instinctively recognized authenticity and were naturally suspicious of defensive behavior. When someone rushed to defend themselves, others sensed that there was something worth attacking. When someone remained calm in the face of criticism, acknowledging what was accurate while ignoring what was irrelevant, observers often concluded that the criticism itself was misguided or malicious. The psychological mechanism behind this phenomenon involved the unconscious recognition that defensive behavior indicated attachment and, therefore, vulnerability. A person who could be provoked into defensive responses was advertising their pressure points, showing exactly where they could be hurt. A person who remained unperturbed in the face of attack was demonstrating either genuine strength or such complete detachment that conventional attacks would be ineffective. But, achieving this level of detachment required more than intellectual understanding. It demanded a practical process of systematically identifying and releasing attachment to every aspect of the constructed identity that could be used as a lever for manipulation or attack. For a political leader, this might mean releasing attachment to approval ratings, media coverage, historical legacy, or even electoral success. Such a leader would make decisions based on their assessment of what would genuinely serve their constituents rather than what would enhance their image. Paradoxically, this authenticity often resulted in higher approval and greater historical significance than the calculated image management that characterized defensive leaders. For a business professional, the process might involve releasing attachment to title, salary, office status, or industry recognition. Such a professional would focus on developing genuine competence and delivering authentic value rather than managing perceptions or defending their position in organizational hierarchies. Often, this authentic competence led to greater advancement than the political maneuvering employed by more defensive colleagues. For an individual in personal relationships, the transformation might involve releasing attachment to being seen as smart, successful, attractive, or morally superior. Instead of defending these self-images when challenged, they would simply focus on being genuinely helpful, honest, and present in their interactions. This authenticity typically created deeper connections than the careful image management that characterized more defensive individuals. The process was challenging because it required confronting the fundamental human fear of rejection and abandonment that drove most defensive behavior. The constructed self existed largely as a strategy for gaining love, approval, and security from others. Destroying this false identity meant accepting that genuine security could only come from within, through recognition of one's essential nature rather than through external validation of one's constructed image. Machiavelli observed that those who successfully completed this transformation gained access to a form of power that was qualitatively different from conventional influence. Instead of power based on force, manipulation, or image management, they wielded power based on authenticity, competence, and fearlessness. This authentic power was more durable than conventional power because it did not depend on maintaining illusions or controlling others' perceptions. The strategic implications of this approach to power and vulnerability extended into every arena of human competition and cooperation. In military conflicts, Machiavelli noted that the most successful commanders were often those who could acknowledge their tactical disadvantages while focusing their forces on areas of genuine strength. A general who admitted his army's limitations in certain types of terrain could choose battlefields that favored his troops' actual capabilities rather than trying to fight on terms that maintained an illusion of universal competence. The famous condottiero Francesco Sforza exemplified this principle in his campaigns throughout northern Italy. Rather than defending his reputation as an invincible warrior, Sforza openly discussed his strategic withdrawals, tactical compromises, and battles he chose not to fight. This honesty about his limitations paradoxically enhanced his reputation among both allies and enemies, who came to trust his assessments of military situations precisely because he did not feel compelled to present himself as infallible. When rival commanders attempted to humiliate Sforza by publicizing his retreats or highlighting his defeats, they found that their attacks had no effect. Sforza had already acknowledged these events openly, discussing them as learning experiences that had improved his capabilities. His enemies' attempts to damage his reputation by revealing information he had already revealed himself made them appear petty and uninformed rather than achieving their intended effect of undermining his authority. In the economic sphere, the principle manifested in the success of merchants who operated with radical transparency about their business practices. Rather than defending themselves against accusations of profit-seeking or competitive behavior, these traders openly acknowledged their commercial motivations while demonstrating how their success contributed to broader economic prosperity. Their honesty created trust with clients who had grown suspicious of merchants who claimed to be motivated primarily by service rather than profit. One Venetian spice trader, Marco Dandolo, built a commercial empire by openly discussing the risks involved in his ventures, the profit margins he sought, and the competitive advantages he possessed. When competitors attempted to undermine his business by highlighting his wealth or questioning his pricing practices, potential clients found these attacks irrelevant because Dandolo had already provided clear explanations of his business model. His transparency made criticism appear like an attempt to mislead rather than an effort to provide useful information. The principle also applied to intellectual and artistic pursuits. Scholars and artists who could acknowledge the limitations of their knowledge or skill while demonstrating genuine competence in their areas of expertise often gained greater respect than those who defended themselves against any suggestion of imperfection. A philosopher who could say "I do not know" when confronted with questions beyond his expertise gained more credibility than one who attempted to construct elaborate answers to conceal his ignorance. Leonardo da Vinci, though he lived before Machiavelli fully articulated these principles, embodied their essence in his approach to both artistic and scientific work. Leonardo freely admitted his failures, incomplete projects, and areas of ignorance while pursuing genuine understanding and authentic expression. His notebooks, filled with honest self-assessment alongside brilliant insights, demonstrated how the destruction of ego-driven defensiveness could liberate creativity and learning. The psychological foundation of this approach rested on the recognition that most human suffering and conflict arose from the effort to maintain illusions about oneself rather than from actual external threats. People spent enormous energy defending reputations, beliefs, and self-images that were fundamentally constructions of the mind rather than essential aspects of their being. The destruction of these constructed identities was therefore not a loss but a liberation from the constant anxiety and effort required to maintain them. This liberation created space for authentic response to actual situations rather than reactive defense of imaginary positions. A person no longer invested in maintaining a particular image could respond to criticism by extracting any useful information while ignoring irrelevant attacks. They could admit mistakes without feeling that their fundamental worth was threatened. They could change their mind when presented with better information without feeling that they had lost face. The practical result was a form of psychological anti-fragility, the ability to become stronger through challenges rather than being weakened by them. Each attack that failed to provoke defensive behavior actually enhanced the person's reputation for wisdom and strength. Each criticism that was received openly and evaluated honestly provided opportunity for genuine improvement rather than threat to self-image. The deepest level of this transformation involved recognizing the illusory nature of the self that most people spent their lives defending. Machiavelli's observations led him to understand that what people typically called self was actually a collection of memories, beliefs, social roles, and ego-driven desires that had no permanent or essential reality. The man who could see through this illusion and identify with something deeper, pure consciousness or essential being, became invulnerable to attacks on the constructed personality because he no longer identified with it. This insight aligned with certain spiritual traditions, though Machiavelli approached it from a purely practical political perspective rather than a religious or metaphysical one. He observed that leaders who had undergone some form of ego death, whether through extreme adversity, philosophical insight, or spiritual practice, wielded a different quality of power than those who remained identified with their constructed selves. Caesar Borgia's transformation after his father's death illustrated this principle. When Pope Alexander VI died, Cesare found himself stripped of the external supports that had maintained his position. His titles, wealth, and political alliances evaporated almost overnight. Rather than desperately attempting to defend or reconstruct his former identity, he underwent a psychological transformation that Machiavelli observed with fascination. The Cesare Borgia who emerged from this crisis was no longer the same man who had depended on papal authority and family wealth for his power. He had been forced to confront the temporary and constructed nature of everything he had previously identified with, and, in that confrontation, had discovered something more essential. This essential self could not be stripped away by political reversals because it did not depend on external circumstances for its existence. When his enemies attempted to humiliate him by referencing his fall from power, Cesare would acknowledge the facts openly while making it clear that his sense of worth did not depend on maintaining his former position. This response confounded those who expected him to be devastated by his losses. Instead of finding a broken man defending his remaining shreds of dignity, they encountered someone who had found a source of power that did not depend on external validation. This transformation was not unique to political leaders. Machiavelli observed similar processes in merchants who had lost their fortunes, scholars who had been discredited, and artists whose work had been rejected. Those who used these experiences as opportunities to examine and release their attachment to constructed identities often emerged stronger and more effective than they had been before their apparent defeats. The process required a level of psychological courage that most people could not muster. Defending the constructed self, despite its ultimate futility, felt safer than confronting the possibility that this self might not be real. The ego's survival strategies, developed over years of social conditioning, created powerful resistance to any investigation of its actual nature. But, for those who could undertake this investigation, the rewards were profound. The destruction of the false self revealed the presence of something that had always been there but had been obscured by the constant effort to maintain and defend the constructed identity. This essential nature was characterized by a natural confidence that did not depend on external validation, a clarity of perception that was not distorted by ego-driven desires, and a creative responsiveness that was not limited by defensive patterns. From this essential nature, authentic power flowed naturally. It was not power over others, which always required defensive maintenance, but power as others, the recognition that apparent separation between self and others was itself part of the constructed illusion. A leader operating from this understanding could serve others' genuine interests because doing so was identical to serving his own essential nature. This authentic power was characterized by what Machiavelli called virtue, not virtue in the modern moral sense, but the dynamic capability to respond effectively to whatever circumstances arose. Because it was not constrained by the need to maintain any particular image or identity, it could adapt fluidly to changing situations while maintaining its essential character. The man who had destroyed his weak self could never be destroyed by others because there was no longer anything that could be meaningfully attacked. His reputation might be damaged, his possessions might be taken, his body might be harmed, but the source of his power, his essential nature, remained untouched by external circumstances. This invulnerability was not indifference or callousness, but the natural result of identifying with what was permanent rather than with what was temporary and constructed. In the final analysis, Machiavelli's insight about never defending yourself revealed a profound truth about the nature of power, security, and human flourishing. The weak self that most people spent their lives defending was not only vulnerable to attack but was itself the source of vulnerability. By destroying this false identity through clear seeing and courageous investigation, an individual could access a form of power that was both more effective and more sustainable than conventional approaches to influence and control. This transformation was not merely a political strategy but a complete reorientation of consciousness that affected every aspect of human experience. In relationships, it created the possibility of authentic intimacy based on truth rather than defensive management of image. In work, it enabled genuine contribution rather than ego-driven competition. In conflict, it allowed for creative resolution rather than reactive escalation. The practical applications were endless because the principle addressed the root cause of most human problems, the mistaken identification with a constructed self that required constant defense and maintenance. Whether dealing with political opposition, business competition, personal criticism, or social rejection, the same fundamental approach applied: acknowledge what was accurate, ignore what was irrelevant, and operate from the essential self that could not be meaningfully threatened. The courage required for this transformation could not be understated. Every social institution, from family to government, was organized around the assumption that people would defend their constructed identities. Choosing to operate differently meant challenging not only personal patterns but societal expectations about how power should be wielded and maintained. Yet the rewards justified the courage required. Those who successfully destroyed their weak selves gained access to a quality of life characterized by inner peace, authentic relationships, creative effectiveness, and genuine confidence. They became sources of stability and wisdom for others who were still trapped in defensive patterns, and their influence extended far beyond what their conventional accomplishments might suggest. Machiavelli's ultimate insight was that true security came not from building better defenses but from recognizing that there was nothing that needed to be defended. The essential self, pure consciousness aware of itself, was already invulnerable because it was not a thing that could be attacked. All suffering arose from the mistaken identification with temporary phenomena that were inherently subject to change and loss. The man who could maintain awareness of his essential nature while engaging fully with the temporary phenomena of life, reputation, possessions, relationships, even the body itself, could participate in the game of existence without being enslaved by it. He could care deeply about outcomes without being attached to them, could work energetically toward goals without deriving his sense of worth from achieving them, could love others completely without needing them to validate his identity. This freedom was the ultimate form of power because it was not dependent on any external circumstances. It could not be granted by others, and, therefore, could not be taken away by them. It was available to anyone willing to undertake the investigation necessary to distinguish between the essential self and its constructed overlay. In the political arena, leaders who embodied this understanding created stable and prosperous societies not through force or manipulation but through authentic service to the common good. In the economic sphere, entrepreneurs who operated from this consciousness built sustainable enterprises that served genuine human needs rather than simply extracting profit. In the personal realm, individuals who had undergone this transformation became sources of love and wisdom for their families and communities. The ripple effects of such authentic power extended far beyond the immediate sphere of influence of any individual. Because this power was based on truth rather than illusion, it tended to expose and dissolve the false structures that created suffering in human societies. A truly authentic leader made it more difficult for others to maintain their own defensive deceptions. A genuinely confident person made it easier for others to drop their own pretenses and insecurities. Machiavelli's observation about never defending yourself was therefore not just a tactical insight but a key to individual and collective transformation. The destruction of the weak self was simultaneously a personal liberation and a contribution to the evolution of human consciousness toward greater truth and effectiveness. As the sun set over Florence on that day in 1513, casting the city in golden light that would soon give way to darkness, Machiavelli put down his pen and reflected on what he had discovered. The principles he had articulated were not merely observations about political power but insights into the fundamental nature of human existence. The man who could destroy his weak self had found not just invulnerability but a way of being that transformed every aspect of experience from defensive struggle into creative expression. This transformation remained as relevant and challenging 5 centuries later as it had been in Renaissance Italy. The human tendency to construct and defend false identities was apparently universal, transcending historical periods and cultural differences. But so too was the possibility of seeing through these constructions to the essential nature that required no defense because it could not be threatened. The choice remained available to each individual: continue defending a self that was ultimately illusory and, therefore, perpetually vulnerable, or undertake the courageous investigation necessary to discover what remained when all defenses were abandoned. For those with the courage to choose the latter path, Machiavelli's insight offered not just political advantage but the possibility of genuine freedom and authentic power that no external force could ever destroy.